Very nice to see you. I'm a great admirer of your work, even though some of your work is rather, of course, terrifying and apocalyptic. But you write about it so beautifully. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little about yourself as an introduction here?
Sure, thank you for that warm welcome. I appreciate that. So, I've been at Middlebury College about 3 years, going on my third year. I spent a while at Bennington College, which is closer to where I live. I live on a farm in southern Vermont with a veterinarian partner and two girls and a whole lot of rescue animals. And before that, I studied anthropology, I studied writing. I've been publishing for about 12 years. I'm about to publish my third fiction book with Scribner and then have a nonfiction book coming out the year after that. And I'm an environmental journalist at The Guardian. So apparently, I have a lot to say, and I find different ways to say it.
And you're also involved at the Bread Loaf School, I believe.
I am. I'm the director of the Breadloaf Environmental Writers Conference, which is a sort of outgrowth of the kind of storied August conference. But we've seen our application numbers really shoot up, I think for sad reasons, which is that, there's an increased amount of urgency around environmental topics. I think collectively we're all doing a much better job of expanding what it means to be an environmental writer. It's not just a white man in a tweed suit talking about, waving bands of wheat. It's more inclusive. It's urgent for everyone. So I love, actually, it's one of my favorite parts of my role at Middlebury is directing that program.
So we're here today to talk a little about COP26, the United Nations climate change conference that's happening right now in Glasgow. And you were invited to write a piece for The Guardian, one of your regular collaborators. What was that? And the thing that you mentioned to me, and I want to, it's very interesting, and it's a question that is, of course, on the minds of a lot of Americans with um, Planned Parenthood or other, reproductive rights conversations. It's just the basic choice, even before it gets to any medical procedure, to even go down the road to having children.
Right. It's I think every writer's nightmare to be assigned this topic, but I think that's the sort of thing I gravitate toward, and I'll explain why. My father, when I was growing up, used to tell me that, he's retired now, but when it came to having a difficult conversation at work, like letting someone go from a job, he wanted to be the one in the room because he thought he could do a difficult thing well. And I think we're in an era of writing where we have to be willing to meet difficult conversations, taboo conversations, new territory. And I felt as though I could write on this topic in a non polemical way. So, one of the tests I often tell my students at Middlebury to think about is how could I write this poorly? And you start there and you think, how do I not mess this up? So, I think it's a very real conversation that we're having and seeing. I have students coming into my office saying, I don't think I want to have children. What do you think? What would you do? I have my daughters who are sort of early teens, and they are asking me, Mom, should I have children? And it's a horrifying question. And I've been thinking, you know what? I'm tired of whiffing at this question. I want to think calmly and in a full-hearted, non-polemical way about this question. How someone beginning to go through this process might think about it, and how those of us in advisory positions might meet this question in a little more generous way. But it really tips toward government leaders to think about how do we make this a livable world? How do we make this a world where people feel safe having families? And that's those are the stakes.
I'm really interested to learn a little bit more about this latest writing, but the thing you just said calls to mind a piece of yours I was looking at from 2019. It's called The Last Column, the mismatch, I think something like that, government malpractice. That you had spent a lot of time traveling around and thinking about government's responsibility for some of these climate change decisions and policies that they've made. Are you still frustrated with it? Do you still feel that governments are not behaving in the way they should be?
Absolutely, more than ever, I think, which is not the answer I want to give, but the answer I can't help but give. But these elected officials should be working for the public good, and not just wealthy special interests and donors or their own special interests or a select few. And I'm seeing governments fall down on this at the local level, at the national level, at the international level. Um, I mean, everywhere we look, I feel like we're out of margin here. There's no, in my opinion, and I know the opinion of others. There's no more space to dodge the question. We're either going to act or we're not. We're in the last chance territory in terms of carbon levels and ecosystem breakdown, and it astounds me. It routinely astounds me how evasive um, government is at this point. I think it should be our number one priority. It cascades into everything. Climate justice is social justice. It's a public health issue. It's an economic issue. I mean, whatever trigger point someone would be waiting for in order to find acting on climate, the number one issue, it's there. The data's there. The qualitative and quantitative evidence is there.
Are conferences like COP26 performative or productive? Are there things that can really come from gatherings like are happening now in Glasgow?
I think the potential is absolutely there in terms of moral leadership, leaning into complexity, the sort of competitive element that, or collaborative, even more ideal, the collaborative effort. I think back to E.B. White's essays for The New Yorker, his editorials, the wartime editorials. They're absolutely beautiful pieces of writing, but they talk about the sort of global mindset around a shared concern over the natural world. And E.B. White was writing on, the heels of World War II and the, onset of the nuclear era. So that was shaping his thinking in terms of end game scenarios. And our end game scenario now is climate, but there's absolutely territory for a shared concern. Although I'll say the picture that I saw that made my stomach drop was the row of world leaders before the Trevi Fountain, tossing coins over their shoulders for good luck for a photo op. And it actually made my stomach turn because I think we're so far past the power of a symbolic gesture. We need a meaningful gesture. And so I have to say, I find things like that really grating because we need substance, we need movement, we need real commitment, not tossing a coin over a shoulder into a fountain. Wishing for luck. There's a quote from a writer, Beryl Markham, or maybe her ghostwriter, actually, but she wrote, "Never hope more than you work." And that was the line I thought of when I saw that line of world leaders tossing a coin into a fountain.
Let's talk about this latest piece for The Guardian, the very, very difficult choice about whether to procreate and bring a new human being into this world that feels like we're on the brink of the possible extinction of the human race. What did you find
Mhm.
in your reporting and your writing that surprised you, disheartened you, or encouraged you?
To write into this topic is to write into a lot of pain and complexity. And I will say, first and foremost, I think it is always improper to address any body that wants to give birth and to make any sort of um, rule or guidance about what an individual should do with their body. I'm firmly against that. And I think any sort of population control often has a racist, reductive, a feel to it. So I want to emphasize that I'm talking about this at a very philosophical level of sitting down over tea with someone who's thinking about having children and talking about it. Some of the things I found surprising. So I connected with some former students and some young people just to take their temperature on this. And I reached out to people from lots of different genders and backgrounds, socioeconomic status, and asked, like, what are you thinking? What do you feel right now? And what was surprising to me was the anger was not surprising. I think young people have every right to be angry with the state of the world and older generations. And I think our generation has underestimated what it's going to be like to live in a time where so many young people might feel hopeless or angry or frustrated. Um, what what I thought was positive was a sense of hope that they were all expressing that perhaps governments will get it right. One student mentioned, "I'm looking for the next 5 years to see if we have meaningful legislation, if we're able to harness technology to address this." And there was still that glimmer of hope. And every student expressed actually wanting to have the option of having children. And so there was still a great deal of desire and hope, and then paired with anger and fear. Um, One thing that I wanted to lean into in this conversation is about people like myself who might be engaged in this sort of conversation with children, with students, with young people. because I think we tend to, in uncomfortable situations, respond with platitudes, and it's really important to me for us to realize we made these decisions and lived in a completely different era. We, I think, can't even fully empathize with the mindset and the state of mind for some of these young people who are aging into this question. Um, so I think leaving space for anger, avoiding platitudes, and also thinking about awkward things like redistribution of wealth. How do we help make it easier so that having children isn't just a privileged opportunity? Because we all know privilege insulates us from risk. So how do we make it easier already for people to have, safer and easier experiences with caregiving and parenting? The other fascinating thing that came up, I was speaking with a friend of mine, Dr. Isaac Leslie, who has studied sociology, and he is queer, and he's creating a farming community where he aspires to, create a non-traditional family. And he talked a lot about his own grieving process for feeling like it wouldn't be responsible for him to have a biological child because of the state of the planet, but then doggedly focusing on joy. How do we have a joyful, hopeful existence? And talking about the fact that community resilience is a form of climate resilience. So, how do we rebuild healthy communities? And really, I mean, with any challenging conversation, there's pain and there's reward, and it felt good to step into a space with people I admire and just mostly listen.
I've seen it, I saw it on Twitter, I've seen it screenshotted and shared across other social media platforms, this um, sentiment that people under 40 have given up anything good ever happening again. Is that a sentiment that you heard reflected in some of the conversations you've had?
I can see why people would feel that way. I have a daughter who hasn't had a so-called normal school year since she was in second grade, and she's in middle school or heading toward middle school. And I think it takes us down this line of questioning of, was the baseline good to begin with? Was normalcy healthy for everyone? When I was talking about this article and writing this article, we're talking about, we want to avoid these nightmare scenarios where people are having children under, compound climate disasters and economic and environmental breakdown. But the truth is that this is already happening in other places of the world. I mean, 100,000 babies have been born in the last few years in refugee camps in Myanmar. There are women already living these nightmare scenarios in other parts of the world. And so I guess the next thing I'll say about hope is that what I have heard is that our generation is really skilled at talking about dystopias, about why things are bad, why things are breaking down, why we shouldn't have hope. But there's really space to sell a better vision here. What if we invested just as much energy in talking about, here's how it could be good, here's how we could improve on community resilience and supporting caregivers, supporting women of color with childbearing and health. How can we do better? How can we make and I think getting to the COP26, there is clear government action that can be taken to improve the quality of life for people. So hope it is a tricky thing. It is a dangerous thing, to care, to invest in these issues, to dream of better is taking a risk. It's putting your heart out there. I think those of us idealists, do it every day.
Is there a balance? The choice to have a child is there's two parties. There's both sexes have to get biologically involved and intermingle in order to create a child. Is the feeling from the conversations you've had different between people who are sexed male versus people who are sexed female?
I think the conversation has changed in terms of, I hear division of labor coming up from both sexes. So a male student that I interviewed from Middlebury said, "I can't wait to have children. I'm waiting to see the legislation for the next 5 years. Also, it's not just my choice." So I think this younger generation is much more skilled than older generations in talking about labor. And equitable labor, especially in the domestic and the professional, and the way those shake out. Again, I think the queer community is a source of learning for a lot of us in terms of the way labor tends to be more balanced, in the way that that is a conversation that's been having in those spaces. I think more often than um, heteronormative spaces.
And I've seen it in so many conversations from people who are at Middlebury now, students who are about to start their higher education career. The idea of found family. I'm making my family out of the people that I meet, that I want to have in my family. Is that an evolution? Can you see that of the family form?
I see that coming forth in so many different conversations, and it was absolutely the idea of chosen family and chosen community was absolutely a part of the conversation I had with my friend Dr. Isaac Leslie. He talked a lot about that, and I think it's interesting in this era where we tend to cluster already in our sort of ideological places, and then the pandemic restricting movement has, I think, perhaps given us a little bit more of a taste about what does a healthy and resilient community or domestic pod look like. Who can we rely upon? How can we help others? I know a lot of my friends are more involved in food security work than ever, making sure that gets out. But I think the tendrils of this conversation about whether or not we should have children or about labor really all gets down to our decency as human beings and how much we're willing to sacrifice in order for other people to be, comfortable and healthy. And I would say that functions both at our individual choice level and government.
That feels so hard sometimes to trust the good nature of humanity versus the ugly nature that the media loves to share with us to get people to buy papers, watch TV shows, and things like that. How do you keep the hope alive in yourself as you're writing about some of these really disturbing and heartbreaking issues?
I don't always. I think I probably should have a more polished answer on that, but I certainly have to make the attempt, because I think for those of us who do pay attention to the natural world and who do look at the science, we're beginning to know the enormity of what we're up against, the urgency, the true tipping points that we've already started to pass, and what it means scientifically. And I think if you're and how that comes down to quality of life and the fact that people are already suffering, and we know that people in frontline communities and people who are already struggling will bear this struggle in an outsized way. I do find it hard to keep hope, but I think the most important thing is to be constructive, to I think this idea of public service, of the public good, which unfortunately I feel like we see play out of the vaccine debate. Are we willing to sacrifice or take action in order to benefit the public good? And allegedly, people have done surveys where that idea of service and the public good has fallen out of fashion since the 1940s, kind of post war era. And I would love to see a movement that really brings that forward, because I know when I'm struggling, I just try to take that energy and move it toward service. So I drive a Meals on Wheels route. I donate like the rest of you guys. I've become more philanthropic in the last few years. But I think sometimes we underestimate the power of just good old fashioned elbow grease in action, because it's become easier than ever just to make a lot of noise online and on Facebook and manifestos. And I think I'd love to see us, especially as we learn more about how to move safely around in pandemic conditions. How can we get back out there and just help?
Thank you so much for taking some time this afternoon to chat about these things. Obviously, there's a lot more to read, to write, to think about. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.